All right, so this is going to be our last formal speaker talk for the day. So I know a few of you here are American, and believe it or not, yes, Canada has a constitution too. We're just not obnoxious about it. Yeah, I think here especially is where we're going to get to the good stuff. I've been a libertarian for about 10 years, and the reason why it took me so long to get involved in organizing stuff like this is because my head was just buried in books all the time. I tried going out to different events, but I was 14 at the time. I went to like bars and no one really took me seriously. So yeah, books were my thing, and I saw in some of the slides there was stuff about like US Mill and stuff like that. I was all about that stuff. I got a quote tattooed on my arm. Yeah, so this is the reason why I picked Derek Frum as a keynote. And his job description is that he defends civil liberties. Like, what's more noble than that? And so I'd like to invite Joseph up to the stage. He is the president of the Whatcom Students for a Stateless Society Club in Bellingham, Washington.
Thank you. So I just met Derek during the break, and he revealed to me that the Canadian Constitution Foundation is, let's say, a partner organization with the Institute for Justice in the States. And I consider that to be a heroic work, and so I want to say that definitely the worthy keynote speaker. Derek Frum is a lawyer practicing constitutional law in Calgary. He graduated with a degree in law from the University of Western Ontario, and earned a degree in philosophy from the University of Waterloo, and religious studies from Briarcrest College. His law practice is focused on advancing personal freedom and economic freedom by protecting the individual liberties from the encroachment of government. Please welcome Derek Frum.
Should have sat closer to the front. Okay, well, you know, I kind of feel like whenever I give this talk, and it's a little bit different this time because there's some things that are more exciting than normal. Well, I shouldn't say that. But whenever I give this talk, I feel like I'm such a downer. I'm like, come in with a storm cloud, I'm going to rain on your parade. It was kind of funny because when I got here this morning, I noticed the Fraser Institute table set up, and they have their new Freedom Index for this year set out. And I wrote an article or a paper in their, I think, 2013 Freedom Index about the rights and liberty in Canada. And I did some media after that, and it was kind of funny because the media would pick up the report and say, oh, Canada's pretty good. I think we're ranked, I think that year, 7th in the world, we're doing great. And then they get to my paper and like, one of these things is not like the other because this Frum guy is so negative. So I kind of feel like I'm out of step, and especially following after Jody, she's so excited and she has great news for you, things are changing. Well, we've got a long ways to go in my opinion. So I don't want to make everyone, I'm just going to move this down, here it says. Don't want to make everyone too disappointed because I think I do have some ideas about what we can do to improve things. So yeah, as was mentioned, I staff lawyer. It's kind of funny. There's only one of us who's called a staff lawyer, that's me, so. There's a litigation director and there's an executive director, we're all lawyers, and they couldn't figure out something for me, so they threw me that bone, I guess. So, is there a charter right to liberty? Kind of a leading question. I've met quite a few of you folks today who are American, and welcome here to Canada. And you may be thinking, well, isn't that an odd question? Because, you know, America has a very strong tradition of liberty, but what about Canada? Well, let's delve into this a bit. So here's J.S. Mill. The classic liberal philosopher, J.S. Mill, said of liberty, the only liberty which deserves the name, he actually said freedom, I consider them synonymous. The only liberty which deserves the name is that of pursuing your own good in your own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Very important. I'll just leave that there and let you read that as I continue talking. So Mill's concept of liberty is powerful and robust. It protects negative freedom. Important, contrasting negative freedom with positive freedom, if you know those two. It protects the negative freedom of individuals, permitting them to be self-determining, free of state interference of any kind, unless it's to prevent harm to another. Unfortunately, this concept of liberty is almost completely foreign to the Canadian constitutional law jurisprudence. And our courts, at least currently, are out of step with the classical liberal philosophical foundations of our very own political system. In fact, the courts in Canada have eviscerated the concept of liberty. Okay, so they've eviscerated the concept of liberty. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was adopted in 1982. The Charter is our Bill of Rights here in Canada. The Charter is a constitutional document that is the supreme law of Canada. It is the standard by which all of our other laws are measured. And most importantly, what it does is it limits the authority of government. It does this by prohibiting the government from enacting laws that violate individual freedoms without justification. That's important, without justification. So the government cannot violate your rights unless it can tell you why and satisfy a court. The Charter offers explicit protection for liberty. Section 7 reads, "Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice." Kind of looks like casting spells. What does it mean? Well, a constitutional guarantee of liberty, if it's going to be consistent with J.S. Mills, should ensure that everyone has the right to pursue their own happiness, so long as their actions don't harm others. Seems to make sense. And such a constitutional guarantee would protect individuals from unjustified state interference with their chosen way of life. But there are many, many ways in which the courts in Canada have permitted the government to impede individual liberty. For example, the government can confiscate your property without any compensation. It can force you to have your photo taken, even if it conflicts with your deeply held religious beliefs. It can force parents to educate their children in a particular fashion. It can force individuals to pay union fees, even if you are not a union member. It can prohibit and punish you for putting something into your body. And it can prohibit you from entering into mutually agreeable contracts with other people. In each of these instances, the government may take these steps whether or not anyone is harmed. In fact, in some cases, both parties in the arrangement, mutually agreeable contracts, both parties might consider themselves to have been benefited. But the government has no hesitancy about arguing that its coercive actions further a public good, or that it's advancing your interests, whether you recognize them or not. Government acts of this type, in my opinion, are an affront to individual liberty. And if Section 7 of the Charter had a robust and meaningful guarantee of liberty, like Mills, each of these government's acts would be constitutionally suspect. So under what circumstances do the courts recognize that the government has violated your liberty? So all these examples I gave you so far, the courts say, no, that's not liberty, the government can do it. Well, what are those few cases where the government has been prevented from violating your liberty? The Canadian courts have recognized that a restriction on individual liberty or individual's freedom of movement engages Section 7. So if the government stops you from moving around, so that basically means prison. But liberty can protect more than this. In an early case, Blencoe, Chief Justice of the court, said, "The liberty interest protected by Section 7 is no longer restricted to mere freedom of movement." Oh, well, that's a step in the right direction, right? Originally, liberty, well, you just can't be put in prison without a good justification. Well, this seems to mean that it's more than that. What can this be? Well, a while later, another justice on the court said, "The liberty interest protected by Section 7 must be interpreted broadly and in accordance with the principles and values underlying the Charter as a whole, so that it protects an individual's personal autonomy." Well, that sounds very promising, doesn't it? That's great. We're going to have a broad right to liberty that protects your autonomy. Well, even though the courts have said that they're willing to interpret liberty broadly, they've been reluctant to do so. In fact, it's become a mantra for legal commentators and the courts to intone mindlessly that Section 7 does not include a number of things, including, what I think importantly, is business or economic-related liberty. Despite this, the Supreme Court of Canada has generally been careful not to close the door on interpretations of Section 7, which might include economic components. Now, here's a case, Irwin Toy. This is really funny. When I was in law school, I learned very early on that the Charter doesn't protect economic interests. Now, what would that be? What would liberty and economic interest be? It'd be like the right to earn an honest living and not have the government take away from you. Okay? So, if we don't have that in the Charter, what does liberty mean? Because as it stands now, according to this Irwin Toy decision, or according to this other decision, is the government can actually take your livelihood away from you, not compensate you, and they haven't infringed your liberty somehow. Strange. Well, what did they say? They said, we do not at this moment choose to pronounce on whether economic rights fundamental to human life or survival are to be treated as the same as corporate commercial economic rights. So, what did they say? We do not at this moment choose to pronounce. Wait a second, so when I was in law school and I was told there are no economic rights in the Charter, the decision that all my teachers and every lawyer in this country will quote to you says, we do not at this moment choose to pronounce on whether economic rights. But yet, exactly the opposite has happened. The court, in this case, did not definitively conclude that economic rights, business rights, the right to earn an honest living are not in the Charter. They did not say that. They went to great lengths not to say that. But everyone treats it as if they did. It's the most bizarre thing. There's an overwhelming tide of opinion that the Charter does not and should not protect economic liberty. And this tide includes none other than Professor Peter Hogg. Whereas if you are familiar with constitutional law, you'll know that Peter Hogg is actually the real Supreme Court of Canada. Because every Supreme Court of Canada decision on a contentious topic, they always say, well, Professor Hogg says, and then they defer to his opinion. So what does Professor Hogg say? He says, there are good reasons for caution in expanding the concept of liberty. But then when you actually read his text and his argument, he doesn't bother to supply any. Just another assertion. It's another mindless intoning of this mantra that the Charter does not contain economic liberty. So, Mill's definition aside, J.S. Mill's definition aside, according to a wide variety of dictionaries, what does liberty mean? Well, it seems to have two major definitions. One is freedom of choice, and the second is the absence of external constraints. And to me, in the political realm, that seems to capture exactly what I would think liberty should mean. So freedom of choice and an absence of external constraints. And so in the economic realm, liberty is often taken as the right to earn an honest living. So the definition of liberty was unencumbered by the courts when the Charter first became the law in Canada. So this provision in the Charter came into effect in 1982. This was JT's dad that brought this in, right? So at that point, it meant exactly what you see it here. No courts had made any decisions on it, and there was no decisions defining what liberty might mean. At that point, the court could have just looked at the dictionary and said, what does liberty mean? But the very, very first decision, so 3 years after this was brought in, the very first decision on Section 7 liberty, this is what the court said. Indeed, all regulatory offenses, so things like not sufficiently licensing your vehicle, all regulatory offenses impose some restriction on liberty, broadly construed, but I think it would trivialize the Charter if we sweep all those offenses into Section 7 as violations of liberty. So, in other words, the very first court decision on this, the justice said, I really like the idea of the charter, and I'm so dedicated to the charter that I'm going to ignore what the word liberty means, because if everything's a violation of liberty, the charter will become trivialized. That's problematic. More dedicated to the charter than they are to liberty. In other words, this judge deliberately chose to curtail the plain, broad meaning of the word liberty. Instead of applying this justification for the government, instead of making the government justify its laws and its infringements of your rights, what the court did is they just wrote it away. Well, when the government makes you do this and you don't want to, that's not a violation of your liberty. It's very patronizing. And the idea, again, was just, we have to have this charter and we don't want to trivialize it. Very strange. So, as a result of this, the courts have been very reluctant to find violations of Section 7 and all sorts of things that would get caught by the dictionary's definition of liberty do not fall within the Charter's scope. For instance, this is just, it's so bizarre to me reading this. Liberty is not synonymous with unconstrained freedom. It does not include a right to transact business whenever one wishes. Yet, by any dictionary, that's exactly what it means. Exactly what it means. Mill would have it mean that. Likewise, the courts have found that liberty does not include the right to smoke marijuana for recreational purposes in the privacy of your own home, or even the right of a doctor to practice his profession. But you know what? It would have made a whole lot more sense if the court early on had said, you know what? These things are clear violations of liberty, and the government has to justify why it's taking it away from you. But you know what? They didn't. They didn't do it that way. Instead, they tightly circumscribed. They constrained liberty, wrote it down, made it tighter and smaller. But what they've done, instead of trivializing the charter, is they trivialized liberty. Which is worse? Some document from 1982 that a bunch of guys sat in a room to try to put together, to come to an agreement on? Or your right to live as you want, provided you're not harming other people? So what remains of liberty now? Now that the courts have emptied it out? Not much. And this is kind of sad, because by 1988, so if we're counting, this is only 5 years after the Charter was adopted, liberty became to mean this: decisions of fundamental personal importance. That's it. Okay. So now, you might have to think about that one a bit. I'm sorry I don't have a slide for it, because when you think about how poor this is really poor. So this is the Morgentaler decision from 1988. Thus, an aspect of the respect for human dignity upon which the Charter is founded is a right to make fundamental decisions without interference from the state. This right is a critical component to the right to liberty. In my view, this right, properly construed, grants individuals a degree of autonomy when making decisions of fundamental personal importance. This is problematic. You have a degree of liberty. You have a degree of autonomy when you make those once-in-a-lifetime decisions that might come along, well, once in a lifetime. So, what's the problem? Well, this does not protect us from those petty day-to-day violations of liberty that occur over and over. First, let's look at it this way. Here's problem number one. The dividing line between decisions of fundamental importance and one that is trivial is completely subjective. Why does legal permission to abort a fetus qualify as more important than that of a doctor to practice his profession? There's no scale, there's no units by which such things can be measured. And it's unlikely that two people would ever rank all the panoply of decisions in their life the same way. Secondly, it's absurd to think that all the minor violations of our liberty aggregated together do not amount to a full-blown state of totalitarianism. Suppose, for instance, that the state decided to prescribe what time in the morning we would get up, what color of clothes we could wear, how often we could go to the bathroom, or how many hours of television we could watch a day. Well, each of these rules, on its own, isn't a decision of fundamental personal importance. But yet, when considered all together, it amounts to complete totalitarianism, and the Charter will do nothing to protect you. It is not a liberty issue to the courts. Third, doesn't it seem logically backwards that we have all these liberal rules for these decisions that are once in a lifetime? So this decision is so important that you get to decide it. The government will get out of your way. Yet, at the same time, it's all those little decisions that are so unimportant, you don't get the choice to make. It's completely backwards. They turned it on its head. And fourth, I can't take credit for this criticism, but who are these lawgivers with all their wisdom and intelligence to decide how we can live our lives, when they themselves were plebes just like us a short while ago? And now we can't be trusted to make decisions on our own, but they're wise enough to make them on our behalf? It's just very strange to me. If Mill is correct, and the only liberty that deserves its name is pursuing your own good in your own way, so long as you do not attempt to deprive others of it, it's hardly hyperbole to say that Canada does not contain a right to liberty. So hopefully I can go through this quick. So what's the solution? Oh, yeah, I did have a slide for that. I'm terrible. Okay, so what's the answer? So this is like what I picked up for a ship on Google, and I'm from the prairie, so the best I could do. I had water and there's a ship. So here's an analogy. Let's say you're going to get in a ship and sail off from Halifax to Lisbon, Portugal. And you only have one chance to get there. So you have to aim your ship just perfectly. Like, okay, and you set off sailing, you can't do any course corrections. Well, let's say when you're making that initial steering decision, you're just off by a few degrees. You're like, well. But the problem is that mistakes over time in something like that become compounded, and you start to see problems, more and more problems. And that's what's happened here. We're way off course, and we need a massive mid-voyage heading correction. That's what I try to do for a living, by the way. And how did we get here? Well, the left, to use that, I really hate those left-right terms too also. The authoritarians, I'll just say that, I don't mean to insult the authoritarians in the room. The authoritarians were very early on in 1982 excited about the charter. It was a tool they could use to force the government to do things. So they got as many of their friends as they could appointed to law schools to teach. The second is on account of these positions in academia, they were able to seed the law journals with articles advancing their own particular point of view. And these journals, in turn, have become the experts and the expert journal articles used in constitutional law cases. And third, over time, more and more judges were the products of this type of law school environment. And as a result, Canada's jurisprudence has drifted further and further away from its classical liberal tradition. And now lastly, this is the one that I deal with very often, is that they mustered their forces and began to intervene in every constitutional case they could, and so they could affect the development of law in Canada. It was a very intentional process. And I think we can see it very clearly if you are familiar with, or you ever happen to read a 1985 case, Simpson, Sears, and O'Malley. It's a case about equality, and very early on, because it was that portion of the charter was actually brought in that year, and that case made it to the Supreme Court in that year. So what happened? When you read that case, you're like, oh, okay, bad decision, I disagree with it, it's not very good. But if you read between the lines, you'll see that, oh, there's all these other parties intervening. And an intervener is someone who has no real direct interest in it, but they say, hey, I have an expertise, I represent these certain people, this people group. This is an important constitutional case, we want to be heard. So the Supreme Court will allow you to intervene in the case so your voice can be heard. Well, the interveners lining up for that all supported the authoritarian agenda. And when you read the decision, one of the judges says, well, we're trying to figure out the facts here, and all the parties agree, and wait a second, all the parties have conceded what the facts are here. So even Simpson Sears, the evil authority, this corporation that was oppressing the worker, agreed. And so here we have a case that was seminal in Canadian law, where you have all these interveners on this side, The plaintiff is on that side. Even the defendant is on that side. No wonder our law is so skewed. So this is what I suggest. This is why what you guys are doing is so important, and why you are so important, is we have to do the opposite. We have to take this word back, and this word has to mean what it's supposed to mean. And we have to do things like get an education. We have to become very good at handling the media. Get yourself out there, write articles, write the editor, have your voice heard. You know, if you go to law school, don't get caught up in this whole thing of power-hungry lawyers. Go there and intentionally, you know, go with the idea that liberty should mean liberty. You should, if you're an academic in another field, take that with you where you go. It's going to be a long course correction. Ships are huge. We have 30 years right now, 30 years of charter jurisprudence that we have to overcome. And it's not easy because at this point, so many of the cases are considered unassailable. They cannot be overturned, but we've got to do it if liberty is to mean liberty in this country. Thank you.